The night respect was tested. In the early 1960s, fame did not always mean safety, and talent did not always guarantee dignity. For Dean Martin and Sammy Davis Jr., success had opened doors across America, but it had also placed them in rooms where power operated by very different rules. Some rooms were built on applause and laughter. Others were ruled by fear, silence, and unspoken threats. This story begins in one of those rooms, on a night that would quietly reshape loyalty, courage, and the true meaning of friendship. It was meant to be a simple escape. No cameras, no stage lights, no tuxedos pressed for an audience. Just a quiet retreat far from the relentless expectations of Las Vegas and Hollywood. Dean Martin arrived relaxed, his trademark calm masking the sharp instincts he had developed long before fame found him. Sammy Davis Jr. arrived lighter, eager for laughter, still believing that talent and goodwill could soften even the hardest men. They had earned the right to rest. They had earned the right to be treated as equals. But history rarely unfolds according to what people deserve. The lodge sat at the edge of a crystal lake, peaceful on the surface, deceptive in its stillness. Inside, expensive wood panels and low lighting created an illusion of intimacy and trust. This was a place where deals were whispered, not announced, where smiles sometimes hid knives. Dean sensed at the moment the mood shifted. The air changed, not with noise, but with presence. A man had entered whose authority did not require introductions. Sammy noticed it too, though he tried not to show it. He had spent his life learning how to read rooms, how to adapt, how to perform comfort even when his own was missing. Laughter came easily to him, silence never did. That night he filled the space with warmth, unaware that warmth can sometimes invite cruelty from those who mistake kindness for weakness. The dinner began politely enough. Glasses clinked, stories were shared. But beneath the surface, power was being measured. Eyes lingered too long, words carried double meanings. Dean stayed quiet, observing, weighing every pause. He had grown up understanding men like this, men who believed respect was something you took, not something you earned. He also understood something else. Once you allow a man like that to humiliate someone in public, you are giving him permission to do worse in private. The first comment landed softly, disguised as curiosity, a compliment wrapped in condescension. Sammy smiled because smiling had often been the price of survival. But the second comment cut deeper. It questioned belonging. It questioned worth. It questioned whether a man who had filled theaters, broken barriers, and carried joy on his shoulders truly deserved to sit at the table. The room fell quiet, not because no one had anything to say, but because everyone knew exactly what was happening. Sammy felt it then, that familiar tightening in his chest. The old realization that success did not erase prejudice, it only made it quieter. He had endured worse. He told himself he could endure this too. He told himself that silence would pass faster than confrontation. He told himself many things until he realized someone else had stopped breathing calmly. Dean Martin set his glass down. It was not a dramatic gesture, no raised voice, no grand declaration, just a quiet, deliberate act that carried weight. When Dean finally spoke, his tone was steady, almost gentle, but there was steel beneath it. He did not argue politics. He did not lecture morality. He simply drew a line, clear, unmistakable. He named the behavior for what it was and made it known that Sammy Davis Jr. was not alone. The power in the room shifted instantly. Eyes narrowed, chairs creaked. Loyalty was being tested, not in words, but in consequences. Everyone present understood the risk Dean had just taken. This was not a man to challenge lightly. This was not a moment that would end with an apology and laughter. This was a moment that could cost careers, safety, and lives. Sammy felt his throat tighten, not from fear, but from something else. Gratitude mixed with disbelief. In a lifetime of fighting to belong, someone had chosen to stand beside him without hesitation, without calculation. Someone had decided that dignity mattered more than comfort. Dean rose from his seat, not as a performer, not as a celebrity, but as a friend. His message was simple. There are tables you walk away from, no matter how powerful the people sitting at them believe they are. There are moments when silence becomes betrayal, and there are lines you do not cross, even when crossing them feels dangerous. They left together. Outside, the night air was cold and clean. The lake reflected the moon as if nothing had happened, as if the world had not just tilted slightly on its axis. Sammy's hands trembled, not because he was weak, but because standing up after years of sitting quietly takes effort. Dean said nothing at first. He didn't need to. His actions had already spoken. What neither of them knew was that this quiet act of loyalty would echo far beyond that night. That consequences would follow. That pressure would mount. That friendships would fracture and power would retaliate. But they also did not know something else, that this moment, erased from headlines and buried by fear, would become one of the clearest examples of what courage actually looks like. Not loud, not violent, not celebrated. Just one man refusing to let another be humiliated. The cost of standing tall. By morning, the mountain air felt heavier, as if the night itself had decided not to let go of what happened. Silence has weight when it follows confrontation, and for Dean Martin that weight settled deep in his chest the moment he opened his eyes. He did not regret leaving. He did not regret speaking. But he understood something instinctively that few people ever truly grasp until it is too late. Power never forgets humiliation, especially when it happens in front of witnesses. Across the property, Sammy Davis Jr. sat alone, staring out at the water as dawn crept across the lake. The events replayed in his mind in fragments rather than scenes. The pause before the insult, the tightening of the room, the sound of Dean's glass touching the table. He had lived his entire life bracing for moments like that, moments when he would be reminded, subtly or brutally, that his success did not shield him from being diminished. What he had not lived with, until now, was the feeling of someone stepping into the line of fire without hesitation. Sammy had learned early that survival often meant endurance. Smile, perform, absorb, move on. But what Dean had done disrupted that pattern. It planted a dangerous thought in Sammy's mind that maybe endurance was not the only option and maybe dignity was not something that had to be negotiated in silence. That thought was powerful, and power always attracts resistance. The resistance came quickly. Dean sensed it first, not through threats or confrontations but through absence. Calls that were usually returned within minutes went unanswered. Familiar names suddenly became distant, cautious, polite in a way that suggested fear rather than respect. This was how influence worked behind the scenes, not with explosions but with erasure. You didn't get warned. You simply found doors quietly closing. Dean understood the language. He had grown up around men who enforced loyalty without ever raising their voices. Men who smiled while deciding whether you were an asset or a liability. He had crossed one of those men publicly, and worse, he had done it for someone the system had already marked as expendable. Sammy felt the consequences in a different way. When word reached him that his upcoming appearances were being reconsidered, the explanation sounded rehearsed. Scheduling conflicts, business adjustments, market sensitivities. Sammy had heard versions of these excuses his entire career. What made this time different was the timing. He didn't need confirmation to know where the pressure was coming from. The insult at the table had not been enough. Power wanted submission, not distance. And submission was something Dean Martin was incapable of offering. They met later that afternoon by the lake, the same place they had sat after walking away the night before. The water was calm again, deceptively so. Dean lit a cigarette, his expression unreadable but his eyes alert. Sammy spoke first, his voice lower than usual, stripped of performance. "They're already pushing back," Sammy said. "I don't know how bad it'll get." Dean nodded slowly. "I do." That was not bravado, it was experience. Dean explained it plainly, without drama. Men like the one they had challenged did not act immediately. They waited. They squeezed from multiple directions at once. They made you feel isolated. They made you question whether standing up had been worth the price. That was how they broke people, not by force, but by exhaustion. Sammy listened, absorbing each word. Part of him wanted to apologize, to smooth things over, to reclaim the fragile peace he had learned to protect at all costs. He had done it before. He could do it again. But another part of him, the part Dean had awakened, resisted. "I'm tired," Sammy said quietly. "Not of working, not of performing, I'm tired of shrinking." Dean looked at him then, really looked at him, not as an entertainer, not as a symbol, as a man who had carried more than his share of weight for far too long. "Then don't shrink," Dean replied. "Let them feel uncomfortable for once." Those words were not comforting, they were dangerous, and they were exactly what Sammy needed to hear. What neither of them realized was that others were already reacting. Phones rang in distant offices. Conversations shifted tone. Names were spoken with concern. When a system built on control feels defied, it responds, not just to punish, but to send a message. This wasn't about Sammy anymore. It was about Dean Martin challenging an invisible hierarchy that thrived on silence. Pressure began to mount from unexpected places. Friends urged caution. Advisors warned of long-term consequences. There were suggestions, gentle at first, that an apology could smooth things over. Dean listened to all of it and rejected every version. Because apologies, when demanded by intimidation, are not peace offerings. They are declarations of surrender. That night, Dean lay awake, fully aware that courage does not eliminate fear. It simply refuses to let fear decide. He knew the risks had escalated beyond embarrassment or career inconvenience. He also knew something else, something that anchored him despite the uncertainty. Once you teach a man he can humiliate your friend without consequence, you teach him he can do worse next time. Sammy, meanwhile, wrestled with guilt. He worried that Dean's loyalty would cost him friendships, opportunities, safety. The thought sat heavy on his chest. He had spent a lifetime being told that his presence complicated things for others. That idea had followed him everywhere, like a shadow he could never fully outrun. But Dean had not hesitated. And that changed everything. By the end of the day, it was clear the situation was no longer private. Too many people knew. Too many egos had been bruised. What had started as an attempted humiliation was evolving into a quiet power struggle, one that would force others to choose sides, whether they wanted to or not. The question was no longer whether Dean Martin had done the right thing. The question was how far those in power were willing to go to prove that no one, no matter how famous, challenged them without paying a price. And the answer to that question was coming. Soon, when power strikes back. The third night after the confrontation arrived without warning, and that was what made it dangerous. True power never announces itself. It waits until you think the storm has passed, until you convince yourself that courage might actually be enough. For Dean Martin, that night began quietly, almost deceptively so, with the kind of calm that settles just before something irreversible happens. Dean was alone in his cabin, the soft glow of a lamp barely cutting through the darkness. He had lived long enough to recognize patterns, and the pattern forming around him was unmistakable. The phone calls that no longer came, the invitations that evaporated without explanation, the subtle shift in how people spoke his name, careful now, measured as if it carried risk. Men like him were used to applause. What unsettled Dean wasn't the silence itself, but the intention behind it. Across the property, Sammy Davis Jr. sat on the edge of his bed, fully dressed though it was late. Sleep had abandoned him. Every sound outside his window felt amplified, every shadow stretched a little too long. He had known retaliation his entire life, but this was different. This time it wasn't aimed directly at him. It was circling Dean instead, and that made it worse. Sammy blamed himself in ways he had never voiced out loud. If he had laughed harder, if he had stayed silent longer, if he had absorbed the insult like he always did, Dean wouldn't be standing in the crosshairs now. The world had trained him to believe that his dignity came at a cost others would eventually have to pay. That belief pressed down on him harder than fear ever had. The knock came just after midnight. Dean didn't jump. He didn't reach for the door immediately either. He waited, listening. The knock was firm but controlled, polite enough to suggest civility, heavy enough to remind him that refusal was not an option. When he opened the door, two men stood there, well-dressed, calm, their expressions professionally neutral. "Mr. Martin," one of them said evenly, "you're requested." Requested, not asked. Dean smiled faintly, the way men do when they already understand the rules of the game. He grabbed his jacket, not because he was cold, but because instinct told him preparation mattered, even when the outcome was uncertain. They led him through corridors he hadn't planned on walking again, down into parts of the lodge where laughter never reached. The room waiting for him was sparse, functional, designed to make people feel small. And seated at the center of it all was the man Dean had challenged, calm, unbothered, already certain that time was on his side. "You caused a problem," the man said casually, as if discussing weather. "Problems have consequences." Dean didn't sit until invited. He had learned long ago that posture mattered in moments like this. Submission often begins with small movements. "You tried to humiliate someone who didn't deserve it," Dean replied. "That was your mistake, not mine." The smile across the table didn't reach the eyes. "This isn't about right or wrong," the man said. "This is about hierarchy, about understanding where you stand." Dean leaned forward slightly, just enough to signal that he wasn't backing away. "I know exactly where I stand, next to my friend." Silence followed, thick and dangerous. The kind of silence that precedes decisions made without emotion. The man across from him tapped his fingers lightly on the table. "You're popular," he said. Loved, respected, that can disappear faster than you think. Dean nodded, so can fear. That was the moment the conversation changed. Because fear was the currency being offered, and Dean had just rejected it. The threat wasn't delivered loudly. It didn't need to be. It was implied in future bookings, in canceled appearances, in whispers that could reshape reputations overnight. It was the kind of pressure that didn't bruise the body but broke men just as effectively. Dean left that room without shaking hands. Outside, the air felt colder than before. He didn't return to his cabin immediately. Instead, he walked toward Sammy's, every step heavy with the knowledge that whatever came next would involve him too. When Sammy opened the door and saw Dean's face, he knew instantly. "They talked to you," Sammy said. Dean nodded. He didn't soften the truth. He never had. "They're not done." Sammy's chest tightened. "Then this is it, isn't it? I've seen this before. This is where people start disappearing, not literally but quietly. Careers, opportunities, friends." Dean studied him carefully. "Are you asking me to stop?" Sammy hesitated. The old instinct screamed at him to say yes, to protect the people he loved by sacrificing himself again. But something inside him finally broke free of that reflex. "No," Sammy said. "I'm asking how far you're willing to go." Dean smiled then, not with humor but with resolve. "As far as it takes." By morning, the retaliation became visible. A call arrived canceling a future appearance with no explanation. Another came from a long-time associate suddenly advising distance. The message was spreading. Standing with Sammy Davis Jr. now carried consequences. What the system hadn't anticipated was Dean's response. Dean didn't make speeches. He didn't go public. He did something far more dangerous. He doubled down. He showed up where Sammy was performing, sat front row, applauded loudly, made his loyalty impossible to ignore. Every appearance was a statement. If you push him out, you push me with him. That kind of defiance rattled people because it disrupted the quiet efficiency of control. It forced others to confront their own silence. But retaliation thrives on escalation, and somewhere in the shadows, a decision was being made. A line was being drawn that would soon force not just Dean and Sammy, but everyone around them to choose where they stood. The storm had not passed. It was only gathering strength. The moment that could not be undone. By the time the fourth day arrived, the situation had moved beyond tension and into inevitability. What began as an insult had evolved into a quiet war, and quiet wars are the most dangerous of all. There are no headlines, no witnesses eager to testify, no single moment you can point to and say this is where it turned. Instead, pressure tightens slowly, invisibly, until something finally breaks. For Dean Martin, that pressure had become physical. Not fear, he refused to give it that name, but awareness. The kind that sharpens your senses, keeps your shoulders tight, your sleep shallow. He had spent his life performing for millions, yet he had never felt more watched than he did now when no audience was present. For Sammy Davis Jr., the weight was emotional. He felt responsible in a way that cut deeper than any insult ever had. He could handle attacks aimed at himself. He had endured them since childhood. What he could not accept was the idea that Dean might lose everything for a stand that, in Sammy's mind, should never have been necessary. That morning, the final message arrived, not in words but in action. A show was pulled. No explanation, no negotiation, just a clean erasure from the schedule delivered politely, professionally, as if it were a routine adjustment rather than a warning shot. Dean stared at the notice longer than necessary, already understanding what it meant. This wasn't about money. It wasn't even about control anymore. It was about sending a message. And the message was clear. You will bend or you will be broken. Sammy found Dean later that afternoon, sitting alone, staring out across the lake. The beauty of the place felt cruel now, like a lie carefully maintained. Sammy didn't sit at first. He stood there, restless, conflicted, the words fighting their way out of him. "This has gone too far," Sammy said finally. "I can talk to them." Dean didn't turn around. "No, you can't." "I can try," Sammy insisted. "I've done it before, smoothed things over, said the right things." Dean stood then, slowly, deliberately. When he faced Sammy, there was no anger in his expression, only certainty. "And every time you did," Dean said quietly, "they learned they could do it again." The truth landed hard. Sammy swallowed. "So what now?" Dean exhaled, the sound heavy. Now we stop pretending this ends quietly. That evening, something happened that no one expected, not because it was loud, but because it was visible. Dean showed up somewhere he had been quietly discouraged from going. He didn't arrive with an entourage. He didn't make an announcement. He simply walked in, confident, unmistakable, impossible to ignore. And when Sammy joined him on stage later that night, the room changed. People noticed. They always do when power dynamics shift unexpectedly. Applause grew louder not because the performance was better than usual, but because everyone understood the risk behind the moment. This wasn't entertainment anymore. It was defiance wrapped in elegance. Some clapped out of admiration. Some clapped out of fear. Some didn't clap at all. Behind closed doors, decisions were being made. This was no longer just about punishing disobedience. It was about restoring dominance, allowing Dean Martin to stand openly beside Sammy Davis Jr. Without consequence threatened the entire structure built on silent compliance. Later that night, Dean received the invitation. Not a request, not a threat, an invitation. A private meeting, one last chance to clear the air. Sammy knew what it meant the moment he saw Dean reading it. "This is where it ends," Sammy said, "one way or another." Dean nodded. That's usually how these things go. They didn't argue. There was nothing left to debate. What mattered now wasn't strategy, it was principle. Dean understood that refusing the meeting would escalate things immediately. Accepting it meant walking into a room where the rules were written by someone else. He went anyway. The meeting was brief. No shouting, no dramatics, just a calm presentation of options. Apologize publicly, distance yourself privately, restore the order that had been disrupted. In exchange, things could go back to normal. Dean listened carefully. He always did. When it was his turn to speak, his voice was steady, almost gentle. "You can take my shows, you can make calls, you can scare people," he said, "but you can't make me pretend I didn't see what I saw." The silence that followed was final. When Dean walked out of that room, he knew something irreversible had happened. He hadn't just refused to bend. He had exposed the mechanism of control for what it was, and once exposed, power rarely forgives. By the time he returned to Sammy, the outcome was already unfolding. Projects stalled, doors closed, old alliances grew distant. The price was real, and it was being paid in full. Sammy struggled with it in ways he had never struggled before. Gratitude warred with guilt. Pride collided with fear. But underneath it all, something new took root, something stronger than shame. For the first time in his life, he understood that dignity was not something granted by powerful men. It was something claimed, even when the cost was high. Years later, people would remember the music, the laughter, the charm. They would tell stories about glamour and excess and talent. What most would never know was this moment, the one that never made the papers, the one that powerful people worked hard to erase. The moment when one man chose loyalty over safety. The moment when another man learned that he did not have to shrink to survive. And the moment when power was forced to reveal its true face, cold, fragile, and terrified of courage. Because in the end, that is the secret history never once remembered. Power fears nothing more than someone who refuses to look away. The price of silence. What followed was not immediate chaos, not shouting headlines or public confrontation. It was something far more unsettling. The punishment for defiance did not arrive with noise, it arrived with absence. And absence, when it is deliberate, can dismantle a life more efficiently than force. For Dean Martin, the days that followed felt strangely hollow. His name was still famous, his voice still recognizable, his smile still admired. Yet behind the curtain, something essential had shifted. Meetings were postponed indefinitely, promises dissolved into polite excuses, familiar voices grew cautious, then quiet, then unreachable. Dean had known this would happen. What surprised him was not the speed of it, but how many people chose comfort over conscience once the pressure was applied. Sammy felt the change even more sharply. For Sammy Davis Jr., rejection had never been new, but this rejection was calculated, coordinated, designed to remind him of an unspoken rule he had spent his entire life navigating. You may be visible, but you must never be protected. The system tolerated him as long as he stood alone. The moment someone powerful stood beside him, the system reacted like a threatened organism. One afternoon, Sammy received confirmation of what he already feared. A long-planned appearance, one that meant more than money, one that represented acceptance, was quietly removed from the calendar. No explanation, no apology, just silence. Sammy sat with the notice in his hands, staring at it longer than necessary. He felt the old instinct rise again, the urge to retreat, to apologize, to make himself smaller so others wouldn't have to suffer for his presence. That instinct had kept him alive for decades. But now it collided violently with the image burned into his memory. Dean standing up from that table, refusing to let humiliation pass unchallenged. Dean noticed the change in Sammy before Sammy ever said a word. It showed in the way he spoke less, laughed less, carried himself with a familiar tension he had hoped never to see again. "This is my fault," Sammy finally said one night, his voice barely above a whisper. "I knew this would happen." Dean didn't interrupt. He let the words come out because some confessions need air before they can be answered. "They don't punish you," Sammy continued. "They punish the people who stand with you. That's how they keep you alone." Dean leaned forward, elbows on his knees, eyes steady. "And that's why standing alone is exactly what they want." Sammy shook his head slowly. "You're losing things, friends, work, peace, all because of me." Dean's reply came without hesitation. "No, I'm losing illusions, big difference." That sentence settled heavily between them. Dean knew something Sammy was only beginning to understand. Silence is never neutral. Silence always sides with power, and once you see that clearly, you can never unsee it. Still, the cost was undeniable. The pressure intensified in subtle but deliberate ways. Venues hesitated, sponsors wavered, advisors suggested distance, always framed as concern, never as cowardice. The message was consistent. This ends the moment you step away from him. Dean refused. Not loudly, not dramatically, he simply continued showing up, sitting in the front row, sharing stages, using the one thing power could not quietly erase, visibility. Every time he did, it forced others to confront a choice they had hoped to avoid. And that frightened them, because courage is contagious, and systems built on fear depend on isolation. Behind closed doors, calculations were being made. This had gone on long enough. The example needed to be sharper, more decisive. Not to destroy Dean Martin outright, that would be messy, but to remind everyone watching that defiance carried consequences that no amount of fame could fully shield you from. Sammy felt the tension tightening like a wire. He began to realize that this was no longer just about him or Dean. It was about whether anyone in their world would dare to break the pattern, whether loyalty could survive when safety was offered in exchange for silence. One evening, after another long day of uncertainty, Sammy spoke words he had avoided for weeks. "If I walk away," he said quietly, "they'll stop, you know that." Dean looked at him for a long moment, pain flickering behind his eyes. "And what happens to you?" Sammy swallowed. "I go back to surviving instead of living." Dean nodded slowly. "Then we don't walk away." That decision did not come with relief. It came with resolve. A deeper, heavier resolve, one that acknowledged the danger without yielding to it. What neither man could yet see was that their stand was already doing something unexpected. It was unsettling people who had grown comfortable with compromise. It was forcing quiet conversations in dressing rooms and back offices. It was reminding others that power, when exposed, depends desperately on people's willingness to pretend not to see it. And that pretending was becoming harder. The final escalation was coming. Dean felt it. Sammy felt it. The calm between storms never lasts when pride has been wounded and authority questioned. Somewhere a line was being drawn that would force one last decision, one that could not be undone, buried, or quietly erased. Because when silence fails to restore control, power only has one move left. And it was preparing to make it. What history couldn't silence? By the time the final blow came, it arrived without anger. No raised voices. No public confrontation, no dramatic warning. Just the quiet, decisive movement of power doing what it has always done best, closing ranks, sealing doors, and rewriting reality. For Dean Martin, the realization came slowly and then all at once. He was not being pushed anymore. He was being contained. The industry that had once bent over backward to accommodate his presence now spoke to him with careful neutrality. Contracts stalled. Invitations evaporated. Old friends stopped calling, not out of hatred, but out of fear. Fear has a way of making cowards look polite. Dean understood the message clearly now. This wasn't about punishment, it was about erasure. Power didn't want an apology anymore. It wanted a warning example, a quiet reminder to everyone watching, even legends can be isolated if they forget their place. And yet, even in isolation, Dean refused to retreat. He continued showing up beside Sammy Davis Jr., not out of stubbornness, but out of principle. He understood something that frightened powerful men deeply. When a person accepts loss without surrender, leverage disappears. Fear loses its grip when there is nothing left it can threaten that truly matters. Sammy saw it too, and in that realization, something fundamental shifted inside him. For the first time in his life, he stopped internalizing blame. He stopped believing that dignity was a burden others carried on his behalf. Watching Dean endure quiet retaliation without flinching dismantled a lifetime of conditioning. The humiliation he had been taught to absorb no longer felt inevitable. It felt manufactured. That understanding was dangerous. Because once you recognize that a system survives on your silence, silence becomes impossible. The final confrontation did not take place in a room or across a table or through intermediaries. It happened in the open, but disguised so carefully that history would later struggle to identify it as confrontation at all. A public distance was engineered. Not announced, not explained, simply arranged. Names that once appeared together stopped appearing altogether. Schedules shifted, narratives softened. The truth was diluted into ambiguity. No one lied outright. They simply allowed misunderstanding to take root. Over time, memory blurred, and eventually the story lost its edges. That was the plan. Dean saw it happening and understood that this was the last move on the board. Power had decided it could not break him, but it could outlast him. It could wait for time to do what intimidation no longer could. He made his peace with that. Because legacy, Dean understood, is not decided by headlines. It is decided by moments, especially the ones no one wants remembered. Sammy struggled more with the aftermath, not because he doubted the choice, but because the world rewarded silence so generously. Doors reopened when distance was implied. Smiles returned when controversy faded. The pressure eased the moment others believed the problem had been handled. But something inside Sammy never went back to the way it was. He performed with new gravity, new defiance, a quiet refusal to diminish himself, and those who paid close attention could feel it. The laughter carried weight now. The applause sounded different. Respect, once withheld, had been claimed rather than requested. Years later, when people spoke about that era, they spoke about glamour, about music, about excess. They told stories that were easy to digest and safe to repeat. What they didn't talk about was the cost of standing up when silence is profitable. They didn't talk about the night a man refused to let his friend be humiliated. They didn't talk about how power responded, not with rage, but with calculated forgetting. And they didn't talk about how forgetting is often the loudest admission of fear. Dean Martin never gave speeches about what happened. He didn't write books exposing anyone. He didn't seek validation. He didn't need to. The choice he made had already defined him more clearly than any public defense ever could. Sammy carried the lesson forward in a different way, by refusing to disappear, by refusing to apologize for existing, by understanding that dignity does not require permission. History tried to erase that moment. But erasure is not the same as absence. Because courage leaves a residue. It lingers in the people who witnessed it. It reshapes what they will tolerate next time. And slowly, quietly, it changes the rules. That is why this story matters. Not because of who was powerful, not because of who was famous, but because, in a world that rewards silence, one man chose loyalty over safety, and another learned he never had to stand alone again. That truth could not be silenced. It was only delayed.